Okay, friends, I have great pleasure in inviting all of you to a lecture by Professor Vikas Rawal on the global economic of pulses, drivers of growth, and key constants. Uh, Only comment that I have to make about this topic is that the research on food security is extremely wide. Uh, because that's one of the fields we are still lagging behind. But whatever research is, I think, is being done is restricted to cereals. Pulses get relatively less attention in this exercise. I remember about 2 decades back, there was some kind of a crisis in pulse production in the sense that acreage under pulse was falling for several reasons, and government had to take serious steps to reverse the trend so that pulses production matches with the cereal production also. This afternoon, we'll be hearing from Dr. Rawal more details of this problem, probably not just in India, but across the world. With these words, I welcome Dr. Vikas Rawal and also all of you to attend to this. Thank you. Professor Rawal?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you,
Yes.
Professor Ghosh. Thank you for inviting me and for this introduction. If you allow me, I'll share the screen and then I will, I think. Yeah, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah, hello, thank you. You know, our work on pulses was basically done for this book whose cover you see on the screen. It's a book that was written in the context of International Year of Pulses, which was in 2016, and we were interested in doing work on pulses because India is the biggest producer, biggest consumer, biggest importer, and really the engine of world's pulses economy. But when we started working for it, we...
Dr. Rawal?
Yes.
Could you please be a little louder?
Okay, let me try. We were asked by FAO to do this study.
Now it's much better.
Yeah, and they wanted us to do this not just for India, but look at the world economy, and that was really a great learning opportunity for us. So what I present to you is essentially a glimpse into the work that we did, but also use it to give you some perspective on what the economy of pulses is like. Now, just some very basic information about pulses. Pulses are very nutritious, and their consumption is associated with many health benefits. They, as is well known, they are rich in proteins. They are also rich in minerals, have high fiber content, low fat content, practically no cholesterol. So they're good for health. They're important sources of plant protein. Now, there are other important features of pulses. This is another feature which is rather well known, that pulses are leguminous crops, which means that they have root nodules which absorb nitrogen from soil air and convert it into biologically absorbable ammonia. So they fix nitrogen from soil, and therefore they don't need any additional application of nitrogen. But not only that, they also release excess nitrogen in the soil for use of other crops. So if you have one pulse crop, the next crop that you grow on the soil benefits from the nitrogen that has been fixed by the pulse crop. So pulses are a source of nitrogen in the soil. They are good for your soil. But there is another feature which is less well known, particularly among social scientists, which makes the study of pulses interesting. Pulses are self-pollinating crops. The plant has both male and the female organ, the flower, and they self-pollinate. This means that cross-breeding pulses using conventional breeding techniques is difficult. You cannot produce hybrids very easily, which means that producing hybrids at a commercial scale is very difficult. The only way to do improvement in seeds is to produce hybrids, then crossbreed hybrids until they stabilize into varieties and release them as varieties. But the difference between seed varieties and seed hybrids is that varieties can be reused by farmers. Farmers don't need to buy but that means that seed companies are not interested in the business of pulses. You know, seed companies are not involved. They're not interested because farmers are not going to buy seeds repeatedly. So the demand insofar as the market for seeds is going to be small. So private companies are not interested. This has meant that seed development of improvement in seed varieties, improvements in germplasm has happened primarily in the public sector. This has been a bit of a, I would say, blessing in disguise. It has meant that the entire thing remains in the hands of the public sector. The entire thing is accessible to farmers. Farmers are able to reuse the seeds and so on and so on. It's meant that the development has been slow. You know, this is the primary reason why development of high yielding varieties of pulses has been much slower than for crops like rice and wheat, because pulses are self-pollinating. But this has changed with coming in of modern genetics, which has made the development of high yielding seeds easier because now you don't need to cross pollinate. There are other aspects of pulses. Because of high protein content of pulses, pulses are highly susceptible to diseases and pests. As they say, just as we like protein, so do insects. So insects feed sort of on pulses. So pulses are really susceptible to pests and diseases of all kinds, including pests that remain in the seed and eat up the seed after the crop has been harvested. They compete poorly with weeds, which means that the problem of growth of weeds is a major issue in pulse production. Environmental stresses such as salinity, drought, flooding, frost, unsuitable temperatures, these are big constraints. So both if I were allowed to use technical term, abiotic and biotic stresses are a big problem in case of pulse economy. Pulse's economy is seriously affected, both in a static sense as well as in a dynamic sense, in terms of the potential for improvements and growth by these problems that I've mentioned on the slide. Okay. Now, this said, if you look at the data, what comes out very significantly, and this is really one big story, uh, uh, is that after a decade of stagnation in the 1990s, there was a significant growth in production of pulses over the last, basically since about 2000. If now this growth has taken place mainly in three commodities, what are called the dry beans. This is the dry beans is a umbrella term used for all kinds of beans, which would include our what we in India call rajma, to moong, to urad, to a whole range of beans that are grown and consumed in Latin America. Uh, yeah, what biologically would be Vinea and Phaseolus genuses. The two genuses, uh, all the pulses that belong to those two genuses are broadly grouped in international statistics as dry beans. These would include, as I said, moong, urad, and rajma in our. I mean, if one was to talk about the major pulses that are consumed in India, so dry beans, chana, chickpea, and cowpea, what in India is often known as lobia. It's a smaller grain, yellowish grain with a dot in between. These are three major pulses which have seen very substantial growth. If you look at the table that's on the slide, look at dry beans, 17 million tons in 1991. only 18 million tons in 21. And then in 2014, it jumps to 24. Look at chana, chickpea, 7 million tons, 8 million tons, and then it jumps to 13 million tons. Cowpea, 2 million tons, 4 million tons, and then it jumps to 7 million tons. Now, the biggest increase, about 5 million tons, has taken place in India. India, as you know, is the biggest producer and biggest consumer of pulses. And this revival took place after a very, very long time. In fact, it's very interesting. Between 1960 and 1980, area under chana production fell in India by about 4 million tons, 4 million hectares. Okay, the area cultivated with chana falls by 4 million hectares. Essentially, it is lost to wheat. Okay, it's a rabi crop in North India. The chana was the major rabi crop in places like Punjab and Haryana and Western UP. It was almost entirely wiped out. Okay, but then in the last 15 years, basically between 1990 and 2020, there has been a 4 million hectare increase in area cultivated by chana. So the entire loss of area under chana was recovered over the last 20 years. And this recovery takes place because production of chana shifts southwards to central India and southern India. From Rajasthan, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Telangana, Andhra, these emerge as major areas of chana production. This becomes possible because of development of new varieties of chana, which are heat tolerant, which can be grown in warmer climates and are short duration crops, and therefore could be fitted into the existing cropping pattern, the cropping cycles. So you basically have you had in India in particular, but there are similar stories from across the world. And in this book, we have really documented those stories for different crops in different countries, how this technological change came about, what kind of institutional structure was behind it, collaboration between national agricultural research systems and CGIAR institutions and so on, how that results across many countries, development of new seed varieties, which then result in this growth. And India is a very interesting example, in particular the story of chickpea chana in India. Along with this, you find over this period, particularly with India as the locus of the story, India at the center, at the helm of this story, export-oriented production of pulses. Okay, this happens in Canada, where they produce lentil, masoor, also dry peas. In the US, where they produce dry peas. In Australia, where they produce mainly chana, but also moong. In Myanmar, where they produce moong, urad, chana, and so on. And of course also sub-Saharan Africa and some countries in the Latin America. So you basically have in many countries across the world, and I'll show you some statistics. Look at these graphs. Look at the graph on the top on total pulses. And I have here export and import of pulses from different regions of the world. As you can see, Asia exports this much, but imports such a large share of total imports. And bulk of this is India. India is a huge importer of pulses. Okay, look at this, North America, bulk of this is Canada, is mainly an exporter and only a tiny part is imported. Okay, look at Latin America, small exports, major import, and that's dry beans. Okay, look at Oceania, this is Australia. Australia is a major exporter. Okay, so you see how there are these important regional patterns, and the locus of this is Asia, and in fact, this is India. Okay, and this is basically the biggest story if you look at the disaggregated picture. Look at chana. This is the Asian import. This is bulk of this obviously is India. This is Australian exports, obviously mainly to India. Look at lentil. Okay, this is North America. This is mainly Canada. Canada exporting to India. Okay, so you see, you have this entire global economy of pulses, which has seen massive growth over the last 20 years or so. And that growth has been primarily driven by unmet demand in India, even though in India also there was a very substantial growth. So there was a substantial growth in India, but that growth was not adequate to cover the demand, and therefore there was a demand for imports, and that demand is met by growth in various countries. Now, this is the interest. There are all kinds of interesting subplots in this story about how growth takes place in Brazil, what happens in Canada, what happens in United States, what happens in Europe. Europe was a big importer of dry peas from the US, and and they imported dry peas for use as source of protein in animal feed. And then they shift. There is a phase in which Europe, in an attempt to reduce dependence on US, introduces support for protein crops in Europe. Dry pea producers in Europe are subsidized, which results in a huge expansion of dry pea production until soybean comes. And soybean emerges as a cheap source of animal protein in animal feed and displaces dry pea. And Europe shifts to direct cash payments from crop specific support, and that's the end of the dry pea production in Europe. And Europe again starts importing soybean from Latin America and from the US. So there are interesting subplots of stories of growth, of constraints that one finds in different countries. But I want to sort of focus on one particular aspect which I'm quite which has been an important engagement as we worked on this book, and it's something that has been quite insightful, and I would say uh, is something quite rather unique. It's something that's not been done, which is that what we did was we actually dug out cost of production data on pulses from all the major pulse producing countries. And this meant obtaining data from China, from Brazil, from Canada, from US, from Australia, from Myanmar, which meant dealing with statistics that were in Chinese language or in Portuguese or in Spanish, and so on and so forth. Google Translate was a huge help, but we managed to actually put together an entire database on cost of production of pulses from across many, many countries and bring it into an analytical framework which was more or less comparable. And this is what we've done. Now, in order to look at the cost of production and margin of pulses crops, we put together data from various nationally representative surveys, and I'll give you a few examples. And what we have done is we've looked at gross margins, which is gross revenue minus variable costs. Okay, so this is what we are doing. We take data on gross revenue, and we take variable crops, which would basically mean cost of seeds, cost of fertilizer, cost of pesticides, and things like that, cost of irrigation, cost of fuel. Okay, it would exclude cost of fixed capital. Okay, those are excluded. Uh, you would see, so that's the limitation of what we are doing. But because data on those parts of costs are more difficult, less comparable, and so on, this is what was possible. But as you would see, this itself is quite insightful. Now, to make these comparable across countries, what we did was we converted everything into quantities of that particular pulse. So if you take data on chickpea, chana, what you do is you take the output of chana and its value in local currency to derive price of chana, and use that price to convert all the costs in terms of its chana equivalent. Okay, so what you then get is a margin, which is basically, if you're producing, let's say, per hectare 2 tons of chana, how much of that chana goes into costs and how much chana is retained as gross margin. So the currency in which you are essentially making the comparison is that pulse itself. So you convert that pulse into its own currency and then you compare. So if a farmer is growing chana in 1 hectare in Canada, how much tons of chana is retained as gross margin in Canada, and how many tons of chana is retained as gross margin in India, and so on and so forth. That's the analytical technique that we use, and we, as I would show, this is quite interesting. Now I've shown here three commodities: chana, masoor, and rajma, as you can see from the images. Right now, we have here countries. Sorry. So we have here some countries that are known to have large scale farms, and you have here major producers which have large scale farms, and major producers which have small scale farms. All right, and this is showing you here, the brown part is the cost and the green part is the margin. Okay, and this is basically the total output. Now what this is showing is that the total output per hectare in Australia is about 1200 kilograms, of which about 500 kilograms goes in cost, and the rest is the profit. Okay, so the green part is the profit, this is the cost. Now what you can see here very clearly is that in per hectare terms, okay, and that's only one part of the story. In per hectare terms, large scale produce countries with large scale production clearly have much higher margins than countries which have small scale production of pulses. Okay, so per hectare, the margin is higher in large scale producing countries than in countries that are small producers. Secondly, the cost is in fact lower. Sorry, cost is in fact lower in these countries. Per hectare cost of production is lower in these countries than it is in countries which have small scale producers. And this again is a feature that you see practically everywhere. Okay, lower cost, higher profit. Okay, the productivity is higher, so the bar is taller. The bar is taller because productivity is higher. The cost is lower, and that means that the margins per hectare are lower, are higher in countries that have large scale production as compared to countries that have small scale production. Now, let me give you some more detailed data for lentil, that's masoor. Uh, and I have here India, Bangladesh, Australia, and Saskatchewan in Canada, which is the biggest lentil producing region of Canada. If you look at the yield, okay, Canada and Australia produce about 1200 quintals, 1200 kilograms per hectare. India produces 721, Bangladesh 950. Okay, if you look at the cost, if you look at the cost, total variable cost, okay, 363 in India, 721 in Bangladesh, 445 in Australia, and only 339 in Canada. So Canada has the lowest cost. Canada is one of the biggest producer of masoor and biggest exporter of masoor to India. The entire production of masoor in Canada is practically for Indian market. Okay, now that obviously then shows how Australia and Canada have much higher per hectare margin than the farmers in India and Bangladesh get. Okay, now it's interesting how this is not only a result of higher yield, it is also a result of lower cost. Now, what accounts for lower costs? Now look at this. The machinery cost is higher in India and Bangladesh than in Australia and Canada. So Indian farmers per hectare are spending more on machinery than Canadian farmers. Okay, you would have thought that Canadian cultivation is more mechanized. I mean, Indian farmers may spend more on labor, but Canadian farmers should certainly spend more on machines. But that's not true. They actually spend less on machines. What do they spend more on? They spend more on chemicals. Much greater use of chemicals of various kinds, in particular plant protection chemicals and what are called inoculants. Inoculants basically are meant for increased nitrogen fixation. So you basically use these chemicals. Uh, Also herbicides. Herbicides are used in developed countries. What are called pre-emergence herbicides. Herbicides that are used. You see, pulse crops do not, as I said, do not compete well with weeds. which means that if you use herbicides, the herbicide would destroy pulse crop. So you have to very selectively, carefully use herbicides, and it can only be used before the emergence of the grain. Okay, so but that is a major process. Also, they use herbicides after harvest, and that's the interesting story. So in Canada, US, and Australia, there's been a big shift towards what is called no-till production. So you do not till the land. This is important because a lot of area that was former grasslands, where the topsoil is not very rich, is thin, and plowing can be quite destructive for soil. Plowing is a big problem. So what they have done is, instead of plowing the soil, they use herbicides to destroy the stubble of the previous crop, and then directly do sowing. Okay, so that on one hand means higher cost for herbicides, but it means you save on the energy cost of machines. So cost of machinery is lower in large scale farming than in small scale farming. This is interesting, and it's a feature that, as I will show, is seen across the crops. So it's not just in Masoor, but you look whatever crop you look at, uh, costs are lower in large scale farming, and that's interestingly very significantly also because of lower use of machines. Now returns, well, this essentially explains what I've just told you. Uh, so as I said, zero or minimum till cultivation has been widely adopted in large scale pulse farms in Canada and Australia. Now, in places in India, Bangladesh, etc., obviously that is negligible because the technology is not available and farmers cannot make that kind of capital investment that is required. And weeding therefore has to be done manually. So that's another reason why cost of labor is much higher in India. They substitute labor with use of herbicides. Okay. Now, uh, there is another important feature. Now, not only do farms in large scale farms in countries like Canada and Australia obtain much higher per hectare returns, but given the large size of farms, these also translate into high per farm and per worker incomes. This is an important problem, and this is a problem that actually points to a bigger structural sort of feature of agriculture per se. World's agriculture today, this is an important aspect. You see, on a 1,000-hectare farm in Saskatchewan, the total annual gross margin of lentil cultivation in 2016 was zero point 0.6 million US dollars. Okay. Now, it's not just a question of margin, it's also a difference in scale. The point is that if an Indian farmer, or you see, or if you look at lentil producers in India having less than 1 hectare of land, the total income from lentil production is just a few hundred US dollars. Okay, that's the comparison. Now, an Indian farmer would barely get a few hundred US dollar worth of income, while a Canadian farmer with slightly higher productivity, with slightly lower costs, and therefore somewhat higher gross margins, would actually have like $1 million worth of income. Okay, and that difference comes from the difference in scale. You see, essentially what you're saying is that if an Indian farmer gets, let's say, 10% return over income, you see, I mean, the Swaminathan formula is 50% return over cost. Okay, that's the kind of return you need for farmers to be able to farming to be viable, right? Now, if an Indian farmer gets 10% return, I mean, that would be like starvation. Yeah, I mean, that will drive peasantry to destitution. Okay, 10% return in the Canadian context, on the other hand, given the massive scale, can mean very reasonable profit. Okay, now that essentially means that if you have this kind of heterogeneity in scale of production, you have some countries with large scale production and some countries with small scale production, you simply cannot compete. You cannot compete with, you cannot say, at the same level of margin, let's produce. Okay, that margin would mean starvation for people in the third world. Okay, simply because the scale of production is much smaller. Okay, now you basically get something similar for chana. Now in chana we've got data from Australia, India, Myanmar, and Turkey. Now that's a very interesting spectrum. No, from Australia, which is largest scale of production, modern cultivation of chana. Turkey, which is traditional Mediterranean production of chickpea. Myanmar, small scale production but export oriented, mainly for India, and India, of course, small scale production for domestic consumption. Okay, now if you look at the numbers, okay, again you see something similar. Okay, Australia has much higher yield than other places. Okay, which means that returns in Australia, look at the returns. Okay, gross margin 737 kilograms of chana per hectare is saved as margin, while in India it's 400, in Myanmar it's 300, in Turkey it's 339. Okay, so that's the difference between large scale production and small scale production. And as you can see again, in Australia, much higher cost goes towards chemical, while if you look at machinery costs, it's much higher, the highest in India. Indian chana producers are spending the most on machines, while in Australia they spend what, one third of this. Okay, so that's the difference. Now this is essentially the story that comes out from comparison of costs, yields, and margins across different countries, and that story is the following. You have in countries, in developed countries, because of technological innovations, because of availability of better seeds, because of better farming practices, because of investments those farmers are able to make, you have achieved higher yields, which results in higher revenue, and you have been able to shift to technologies which involve lower cost of production, which has meant that on one hand you have higher per hectare margins, and on the other hand you have bigger scale of production. Now that's a double benefit, and that results in a situation where so in Australia the gross margins are about 57% of total output. In India, Myanmar, and Turkey, okay, you have 34 to 40% of gross value of output. Okay, now cost of seeds is high because high seed rate requirements. In Australia, you have improved seed varieties that are practically purchased every year, while in India farmers would not purchase seeds every year. You have higher use of plant protection chemicals. In small farming, you have weeding, while in large scale production it's replaced by herbicides. So use of herbicides, less use of machines, no till production results in lower cost in chickpea, just as I explained it happens in case of masoor. Now while there are some variations across crops, if you compare pulses with competing crops, okay, that is say in India, wheat and chana are competing crops. A farmer can choose to grow chana or wheat. The during the Green Revolution period, farmers in Punjab and Haryana switched from chana to wheat. Given the agroclimatic conditions, two crops that can be basically be alternatives for a farm. Now, in countries with small scale production, margins in pulse crops are lower than margins in competing crops. In 2013-14 in India, the ratio of average returns from cultivation of chana to average returns from cultivation of wheat was only about 14% in Haryana, 32% in Rajasthan, and 26% in Madhya Pradesh. So that is what we are saying is that a farmer who produces chana in Haryana gets 14% of returns that a farmer producing wheat gets. Okay, and that explains why wheat is preferred over chana. In most cases, pulses are grown by producers who are unable to grow competing crops because of constraints like poor soil quality or lack of irrigation. Irrigation is a big constraint. When in fact, those who have access to water will immediately shift from chana to wheat. That's essentially how it works in India. Smallholder producers in developing countries often combine pulse production with production of other food crops in view of nutritional benefits. So pulses are often intercropped. They are intercropped. They are used as border crops. Our arhar, for example, pigeon pea, is often grown as a border crop on fields. So this is a feature of production on small scale farms in less developed countries. On the other hand, in countries like Canada and Australia, the yield disadvantage of pulses is considerably reduced with higher adoption of technology and economies of scale on large scale farms. Pulse production on large farms in Canada, Australia, and Brazil is more remunerative than the production of major competing crops. So, masoor in Canada is more profitable than wheat in Canada. You see, that's the extent of technological advance that has taken place. In Canada, gross margins in lentil production are estimated to be 1.8 times the margins in wheat, 1.7 times the margins in canola, that's mustard, and 3.6 times the margins in soybean. Okay, that's the nature of technological change that has taken place. Returns from dry pea production, which is our that yellow mutter that we get in India, are estimated to be twice the returns from soybean and roughly equal to returns from wheat and canola, that's mustard. Now, it's interesting. Dry peas are grown for two markets. There are two markets for dry peas. One is used as animal feed in developed countries, where there's been a decline in that market because of switch from dry peas to soybean. The second market, interestingly, is India. India is a major importer of dry peas. Why do we import dry peas? Dry peas are not a major pulse that Indians consume. Where do we consume, the dry mutter, yellow mutter? It is imported at a very large scale. India is the biggest importer, biggest consumer of dry peas, something that's not directly part of our diets in any part of the country. It is imported essentially to adulterate besan. Large scale producers of besan basically mix pea flour into chana flour. Okay. Similarly, Canada until recently mainly produced the yellow masoor, yellow lentil. And India was the biggest importer of yellow lentil. Now, in India, the masoor that we consume is a pink in color. It's not the yellow variety of lentil that we consume. But in addition to the pink variety of masoor that India imports from various countries, including Canada, India also imported large quantities of yellow masoor, which were used in India to adulterate tur. So yellow masoor in India is imported in very large quantities to mix it up with arhar and sell it as arhar. Okay, so a lot of arhar that we consume is perhaps masoor that has been imported from Canada. So that's the kind of stories that one finds. But if I have to sort of quickly summarize the main findings, the farms in all these countries, including Australia, are predominantly family farms. But there is a great asymmetry in farm sizes. In the international writings on agriculture these days, the international narrative on agriculture, family farms has become a buzzword. But what we find is family farms are highly differentiated across the world. You have 1,000-hectare family farms in US and Canada and Australia, and you have what 1/10 of a hectare farms in places like India. According to data from 2010-11 agricultural census, the average cultivated area of a grain producing farm in Australia was 1490 hectares. That's a family farm. In contrast, the median holding in India was only about 0.6 hectares. The huge disparity in farm sizes and variations in per hectare margins imply a massive inequality in total farm incomes between family farmers in countries with large industrialized production and countries where pulses are produced on small holdings. And this sort of segmentation of the world of farmers is, I think, critical in a situation where agriculture has been globalized. Margins in South Asia, Myanmar, Sub-Saharan Africa, countries with predominance of pulse production on smallholder farms are much lower than in Canada and Australia, where production takes place on large industrial scale farms. These two images are sort of give you a sense of the two worlds that exist. an African farmer basically loading his pulse crop on a donkey, and the big machinery being used for harvesting in Canada, or masoor harvesting, lentil harvesting in Canada. Among all the countries for which data were available, lentil production in Canada has the highest per hectare margin, while urad production in India had the lowest gross margin. And that's the scale one is talking about. It's more than 10 times return that masoor producer in per hectare return that masoor producer in Canada then gets as compared to an urad producer in India. There is a clear margin on large scale industrial farms and small producers in developing countries. Former being much higher than latter. In countries like Canada, US, and Australia, where pulses are grown on large industrial farms, use of no-till cultivation with pre-emergence application of herbicides and use of inoculants to maximize nitrogen fixation are common. Interestingly, farming in these countries involves much less expenditure on mechanical power and human labor used in tilling and weeding on smallholder farms. So smallholder farms are actually just spending much more labor and much more on machinery than large scale farming does. Not only are per hectare margins higher on large scale farms, the sheer difference in scale implies that there is a huge disparity in incomes that a smallholder family producing pulse producer has as compared to a family farm that grows pulses on hundreds of hectares. I think that's essentially what I have to say. Let me stop here if you'll allow me, and we can have discussion.
Yeah.
Uh,
Is this working?
yeah, thank you, Professor Rawat.
Yes, I can hear.
I was just wondering, in view of these wide variations in costs and farming size, margins, etc., is it necessary for the government to have a reform in the pulses policy?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, in fact, I mean, the big change that we need, and I think it's a change that has benefits in many, many ways, is for India to introduce pulses in its public distribution system. If India says that, in addition to 5 kilos per person of cereals that we give, we are going to give 2 kilos of pulses. Okay, or even if in fact we say 4 kilos of cereals and 2 kilos of pulses. Okay, and for that we are going to introduce procurement of pulses at a reasonable MSP. It would have enormous implications in various ways. It would mean better nutrition. It would mean ecologically better crops being incentivized. It would mean you would have farmers in Punjab growing tur instead of rice. Okay, it would mean shift to chana. It would be an enormous incentive for farmers. It would have huge implications for nutrition. It would have huge ecological implications. You would switch from high water using crops to less water using crops. You would use less fertilizer and whatnot. So the benefits of having a revised state policy towards pulses, making pulses at the front of front loading pulse procurement and
Yes.
distribution in your food policy has enormous benefits, and there is absolutely no reason why the country should not do it. There is absolutely no reason why country should not do it. It would in fact be, I'm sure, resource neutral. You have 100 million tons of grain rotting in your godown because you are not distributing it. If instead you just switch to 2 kilos of pulses distributed to every NFSA beneficiary, and you say we are going to procure that much pulses, it would become a game changer for India's agriculture.
Exactly.
So absolutely. And there is actually it's incredible how simple the answer is, and the range of benefits that can be derived from it.
I'm not sure about the price data in the market, but I think pulse prices increase at a faster rate than the cereal prices.
Well, yes, Uh, but the problem is in both levels. One is it's not just the rise; they fluctuate much more. They fluctuate much more, and this has various implications. One is India's whole procurement and distribution system is in a mess. Last few years we have accumulated massive amounts of grain
Yes.
which the government is unwilling to distribute. Only, I mean, it's incredible how recently in 2016, 2017, or was it 2017 and 2018, we imported millions of tons of wheat. 5 million
Yes.
tons of wheat were imported from
Pulses.
Ukraine and Australia. You see, we imported 5 million tons of wheat. Today, we are sitting on 100 million tons of food grain in the godowns. Okay, so our lack of perspective results in a situation where 1 year you're facing a shortage, the other year you're facing a surplus. This is much more serious in case of pulses. We don't have a systemic structural sort of design of a policy. So it results in a situation where in 1 year you have a glut, next year you are short. And the
Yes.
problem is that pulses is a commodity where you are imported on grains, not only on imports, and not only you are dependent on imports. These countries are producing pulses for you. They don't have any alternative market for it. Myanmar does not produce urad for anybody else. They only produce it for India. Canada, in fact, if India does not import masoor, their masoor is wasted. Now, how do they plan their production if you are going to change from 1 year to the next? 1 year you impose a restriction on imports. Next year you say we want imports from the whole world. You want to buy up all the pulses of the world because you are falling short. And next year you say not allowed. You see, now this is crazy because obviously then the countries that are exporting it to you, they don't know how to design their production. Those farmers don't know how to. But it's interesting, they cope with it because particularly countries like Canada and Australia have fantastic systems of support to their farmers. I mean,
Yes.
it's interesting. Saskatchewan, the University of Saskatchewan gives monthly advisories, which are the most useful, prompt, and fastest source of information on what government of India is going to do about pulses. If you want to know what government of India is going to do, subscribe to the mailing list of University of Saskatchewan, because they are the most prompt. They follow what's going on and they are there to inform their farmers. They are there to advise their farmers on what they should be doing, because India has taken certain decisions. How would they, I mean, can they save their crop for the next year? What is the likelihood that this would happen next year or not? What should they do? What kind of phytosanitary regulations are being brought in India? How should they deal with it? Incredible level of information support is provided by them. So they are able to cope with that to some extent. But from our side, we don't make it easier. you know.
Yes, I agree. Are there some questions in the chat box?
Yes.
Yes. The first question is about the cost of production. Were you able to take into account state subsidies to those producers, unlike among labor? Well, yes and no. Direct cash transfers, no. I mean, that's obviously not crop specific, so that cannot be taken into account. But where you have crop specific subsidy, like our MSP, that's taken into account because that shows up if farmers are able to sell at MSP, then it would show up. If diesel is subsidized, then your cost of diesel goes down and so on. So to some extent, state support is accounted for. But this essentially, what I'm saying is that the support and subsidies given in developed countries is primarily decoupled subsidy, and that is not accounted for. Despite that, you find that margins are much higher. Even when we are not taking into account subsidies being provided to farmers in the US and Canada and so on, despite that, they are getting much higher margins. If you take into account the additional support they get, then the difference becomes even starker. You know, uh, So that's one. The second question is about what are the margins in Central and South India? Was any study done in actual process of decision making on technology of small scale actual availability of herbicides in India dangers? Well, Central and South in India is a very interesting story. So we have a fairly detailed discussion of it in the book. I would advise you to look at it. You can download it from the FAO website. The book is available for download. Please have a look. But you know, it's a very interesting story. It's a story of not. So one, of course, is the fact that that, as I said, you have developed new varieties which are heat tolerant and are short duration, which has allowed pulses to be incorporated into cropping cycles in central and southern India. Uh, so chana is being produced in these places. But there is another aspect to this. You see, pulses, given the way the root nodules are, result in fungal buildup in the soil. So if you repeatedly grow pulses in an area, slowly the productivity falls because of fungal buildup in the soil. This was a major problem in pulse growing regions in North India, in places like Punjab and Haryana and Western UP and so on. Because these are traditional chana growing areas, there was a growing problem, a big and growing problem of fungal buildup in the soil, which results in lower yields. When you switch to new areas, that problem is not there. So the productivity is actually higher, both because you have new varieties and because these are virgin soils, these are fresh soils, these are soils on which pulses have not been grown in the past. And as a result, the yields in central and South India are actually pretty high. That's likely to be, that advantage is going to be there for some time. Okay. And you know, but right now we are in a phase where productivity levels in central and southern India are high, and therefore, you know, margins are somewhat better. But these are areas where you have less irrigation. And the reason why chana is being grown instead of wheat is essentially because farmers who have constrained access to water grow it. You know, that's essentially the reason. Herbicides are not really used very much in pulse production in India. I mean, herbicides are expensive. Pulses are not really terribly profitable. So shift to use of herbicides for in place of weeding labor is a phenomenon that is in its infancy. You see it in you know, places like Haryana and Punjab. In cotton, for example, there is an increasing use of herbicides, sort of illegal, unregulated use of herbicide tolerant seeds and so on. But that's not something that you see in pulse production in India. I'm not sure which if pre-pulse study you're referring to. It's perhaps a study that's been done after ours. On market prices, of course, we have a whole chapter. We have a whole chapter on market prices and costs, a fairly detailed analysis of India's experiments with futures trading in chana, in pigeon pea, and so on. We also have a fairly detailed analysis of value chains, pulse processing industry, and so on. So, you know, we've got a whole chapter that deals with supply chain, markets, and prices. So I mean, I'm afraid I'm only going to have to advise you to look at the book, because that's going into a whole new direction. And that is in fact an important part of the study. That's an important part of pulses economy, particularly in India, because in India we have pulses which are de-shelled and split pulses and so on. So pulse processing is an important part of the entire thing. Let me. Somebody wants a.
Is there any other question?
I'm just picking up a URL for the book which somebody has asked for in the chat. I'll just.
Yeah.
Put it here. Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
There is a question about
People are asking for the
there are concerns that environmentalists appear to raise regarding environmental costs of large-scale farming. They're recommending
Acha.
smallholder farming. So if one factors in environmental costs, margins will be less. Uh, yes and no. I'm not sure. I think one needs to be more careful about this. This needs a careful analysis. I don't think small scale production in India is today necessarily environmentally better than large scale production in developed countries. I'm not sure if that's the case. I mean, the use of fertilizers in India today is much higher than the application of fertilizers in on large scale farms in developed countries. We use more fertilizer. Our fertilizer usage is far more imbalanced. Productivity of fertilizer use is among the lowest in the world. I mean, India's productivity of fertilizer use. So I'm not sure if one can make a blanket statement like this, that small scale producers are necessarily environmentally better than large scale producers. I think it's the story is more complex than that. Yeah.
Okay.
So I have a
Oh, please.
So Professor Rao, I just wanted to understand that the thing that was very interesting was that there was this huge growth in pulse production or demand post 90s. So when we study, say, for example, the history of liberalization and so on, so this is the period that was also saw a huge growth overall. But people have been trying to understand that what were the drivers of this growth. So could this, so is it in any way linked to opening up of the economy, this massive growth in pulses production, or do you think that it was a result of the research and the collaborative efforts of the public sector that went into it for the preceding period that led to this huge growth? And was this growth, is it mostly, say, a supply side driven growth, or was it that there was a huge growth in demand that time? So this is one question that I have. And second question that I was interested to ask is that I noticed that in terms of that table where you were showing the yield per hectare, Bangladesh was much higher than in India. So like if we are trying to understand the small scale versus large scale, maybe like I missed that point, like how do you explain this higher yield in Bangladesh?
Yeah, okay. The first question, I think pulse growth of pulse production has happened despite globalization. Not because of globalization, but it's happened despite it. And I think, it's been a blessing in disguise that the private sector is not interested. Okay, because, you can't have hybrids. So the entire research has remained in the public domain. And that's meant that, pulses were never the focus of, the liberalization and what the corporate sector was after. Uh, it means that, but so the answer is in the second part of what you said, except that that has happened during the liberalization period. It's a story of an exception to the general trends in during the liberalization period. This is a story in which major technological advances happened during this period under the leadership of public institutions. Okay, now that's the interesting part of what's happened in case of pulses. Now, it is clearly a result of a fairly substantial gap in the demand and supply in India. So there is an unmet demand for pulses, which is being met by imports, and there is obviously to that extent some incentive to expand production within the country. That said, it is not like India's per capita consumption of pulses is increasing. No, it is falling. It is falling both because the pulses have become more expensive. They basically become unaffordable for the poor. Poor have switched from pulses to aloo. I mean, you instead of having dal and rice, you have aloo ka sabji and rice. No, so there's been a shift from a source of protein to carbohydrate. But there's also been a shift, for example, to poultry and eggs, because if you look at cost of protein, poultry has emerged as the relative difference between cost of protein from poultry to pulses has shifted in favor of poultry. So poultry is emerged, the difference has narrowed, and in fact, in some cases, poultry is perhaps now cheaper than pulses as a per unit cost of protein that you get out of it. So there are these factors because of which per capita demand for pulses in India has not grown, but India is still a big consumer. Per capita demand is still very high. In other parts of the world, there has been a massive drop. I mean, the drop's been much higher. Rich countries, hardly any consumption of pulse. Basically beans. It's only in a few countries where beans are a traditional crop. Egypt, Brazil, where beans are a traditional item in the food commodity that they are consumed. That's partly also the reason why you see the difference between Bangladesh and India. Masoor is the major pulse crop for Bangladesh. Masoor is not the major pulse crop for India. In India, Masoor is mainly consumed in Eastern India. Okay, and Eastern India is not really the engine of growth for pulse production. So you are basically importing Masoor. And the engine of growth in India's pulse economy has been chana. Okay, and to some extent tur. Okay, but because tur is the prices are high, so returns from tur are high. Masoor is not really there, but Bangladesh, Masoor is the major pulse crop they consume. So there is, for that reason, greater focus on developing and introducing new varieties of Masoor in Bangladesh. In collaboration with international CGIAR and national agencies. You have a much stronger story of introduction of Masoor crops in Bangladesh than you have in India, where the focus has been on pigeon pea and chana. Yeah.
So thanks again, Professor Rawal. I personally was highly benefited by the lecture. I didn't know that the global economy of pulse is so interrelated. I thought that as a crop which is secondary to cereals, probably it is a much more domestic phenomenon than an international phenomenon. So thanks again. I am sure all the other listeners have also been benefited by the lecture. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.